All right, so we'll get started. So my name's Robert Block, Senior Vice President of Identity Strategy at SecureAuth. Tom, if you were in the last session, set a great foundation for all the different moving parts within the security framework and other areas of digital transformation. I'm just going to kind of hone in on using 2 or 3 of those domains and intersecting them more intelligently around pulling the best from identity and the best from security to more securely enable your digital transformation initiatives and what that should mean. So when I started putting the content together, 20 minutes is tough to figure out how much do you want to deliver and how quickly can you get to value in that conversation. But most importantly, I thought, how do I even help set the stage for what is digital transformation? And oddly enough, so Tom gave a great definition. So here's the same definition, but a different set of words, right? But the bottom line is, how do I use digital to transform how I build a new model for our organization? And when I started looking at examples, I found this white paper. Oh, you can't see it. It's just not rendering up here because of this dead space. So there's a link at the bottom of this. I don't know if you guys get the content or not, but there's a link from CIO.com, this article that had 12 different success cases of digital transformation. It was published like 4 months ago. And so I just pulled about 7 of them as examples because I thought it was interesting that many of them all have different perspectives on what was valuable to them. So like Armstrong World Industries, this 110-year-old manufacturing organization, for DT to them meant moving a lot of their internal applications to the cloud and becoming more agile so adopting manufacturing agile principles and applying them to IT and technology, which freed up a lot of cost and folks to do better in different things. And notice the last bullet, they reapplied a lot of that cost savings to areas in cybersecurity where they weren't investing today, because it was always, hey, here's our top 10 initiatives, we'll fund 3, and never does cybersecurity get enough. And so now by following a more agile and lean set of processes, being more transparent to the business, including the business and collaborating around what to do from a digital perspective, they found a way to make more investment in cybersecurity. Or it's companies like Putnam Investments, where they wanted to bring more collaboration tools to their internal users, or apply machine learning to how they're going to investigate their customers and work with their customers more uniquely. Or it was companies we've heard of every day like JetBlue or Target, and how they were going to flip the software development lifecycle model on its head and deliver more fluidly in channels, in multi-channels, as Tom said, to their customers, depending on whether it was inventory availability, depending on whether it was how do I provide the most ease of use from a technology perspective so that you can buy from me, book your airfare, do everything through our mobile app more richly. Whether it's Capital One, it's interesting, every time I go to one of these conferences, Capital One's usually speaking. I mean, they would almost describe themselves as a technology company who provides banking versus a banking company who has to invest in technology. And I think this bullet here is just more about how they're first to market in their vertical relative to adopting digital technology. Or whether it's CVS, who, in healthcare, where they're considered somewhat laggards from a or from a digital tech perspective, decided that they needed to hire a chief digital officer, and that person's first job was to create an ability to have an open marketplace where they could take on technology vendors that would allow them to deliver integrated curbside delivery. So there was use case after use case after use case. There were a dozen of them in this article. And some were very B2C, some were very B2B, and some were very B2E. And so it led me to understand, listen, digital transformation can mean whatever it needs to mean to your organization. From our perspective around securing it, it all meant the same thing. No matter what you're doing, you're moving more of your ability to access things to the digital world, to the cloud world, whether it's PaaS or IaaS or SaaS. You're doing something from a digital perspective. And now my slides are getting ahead of me. There we go. And ultimately, as Verizon is teaching us, right, year over year, the amount of breaches is increasing, and that increase is because of the credentials. And now you're putting these credentials in a place that you have less and less control over. And so ultimately, as easy as people make digital transformation seem, from an attack perspective, it's very messy and complex relative to identity and security, right? So what do I mean by that? Attack paths are complex. They become even more complex when you start to look at most organizations who live in a hybrid cloud environment. So just interactively for a second, show of hands, how many have an on-prem infrastructure? How many have a cloud-only infrastructure? Right, so everybody has, oh, look at that. I think you guys might be the first time someone said, yeah, we did. So by and large, most people have a hybrid environment, and so it's even more complex to plot the vulnerabilities that exist in those networks across your on-prem and or cloud environments. Next, when you look at access paths, they are typically very complex. You're dealing with identities and accounts. Then you wrap in entitlements. Then you wrap in some relevance of entitlements to roles and relationships to applications. And you can start to see that this cross-streaming of access becomes very complex. And then you quantify that problem worse by saying, hey, here's our on-prem problem, here's our cloud problem, here's our hybrid mix of both. Trying to manage those from a SOD or privileged or roles perspective is extremely nuanced inside that layer of complexity. So now you're worried from a security perspective about the vulnerabilities in your network, the access within your network, the entitlements within those pieces of access so that people can, you can limit lateral movement, limit escalation, et cetera. And the bottom line is that ultimately, real attack paths are real complicated. Whether you're attempting to access an on-prem resource or attempting to access something you've just now done in the cloud to make digital transformation become a reality to your organization, this is the ugly underpinnings that no one wants to talk about, right? I mean, listen, there are a lot of successful digital transformation initiatives. Whether you're a small company or a large company, this is the piece that vastly goes non-discussed because it's the legacy approaches to how we manage access, the legacy approaches to how we manage identities, the legacy approaches to how we govern and monitor that access that continues to create this way for attackers to be very successful in orchestrating ways into your environment from a credential perspective. Not to mention, I don't know if you look at any of the latest Gartner research, if you look at any of the latest Forrester research, they're all focused on the balancing act between becoming more secure in your digital transformation initiatives and also being very frictionless to your user experience because of how easy and the demand is for consumers to want to get services from you until they become disenfranchised in your experience and easily move to your competitor. So the balance between how you layer in security and how you keep it frictionless becomes something that folks find cumbersome or arduous. We did a tech trend survey a year ago now. 56% of the respondents said, listen, I know we need stronger security, but I'm unwilling to deploy it because of the disruption it has to my end users. So we'll just live with the risk inherent to usernames and passwords because we're afraid to encumber the end user process. So because of that, this is where we feel lots of the organizations still live today. So again, if I can do a show of hands just by the people we have in the audience. How many have a second factor authentication deployed today? All right, leave your hands up for a second. How many have an adaptive access policy logic applied to that? So you don't count. So you saw the hand, thank you. So you saw the hands were pretty wide across the room from a second factor. So we're realizing the value in putting stronger security controls in place in front of something like username and password. And then I think the hands went down by about 80% when we asked, or when I asked how many are applying some sort of adaptive or analytics logic to that. And what I mean by that is here's where we need to be as an industry, right? So not just worried about the stronger, gosh, this thing's it's got to be the most temperamental. All I do is my finger near it and it moves. We need to be consciously conscious of how secure can we be and how can we continue to elevate the end user experience at the same time. And here's what I mean by that, or here's an example of what that should look like. So the eyesore in the middle, all the green checks and the red X's, that just should mean to you guys, what is your internal tolerance for risk in your organization? And then it's up to you to decide, moving from standard to malicious, how many, if you will, X's need to occur before I apply some degree of friction to my user who's going through this digital transformation experience. If I spend all this time moving our services to a mobile app and our portal and some way to interact with our consumers or our business partners in the supply chain manner more effectively across those channels, how do I do it in a way that says, hey, if I can notice that you're coming from a known device, you're in our directory with a valid credential, you're coming from a geo we do business in, you've been put inside our fence, maybe from a corporate perspective if we're talking about B2E, there's no velocity violation, yes, I should allow you in that username and password. And then, listen, not everything has to go from binary, hey, single factor, to immediately stepping up based on one variance of risk, right? Now maybe I don't know the geo or it's new to you or you're outside our corporate fence. I mean, that's a traditional use case scenario where, hey, I should step you up. Here we're saying, no, we know everything else about you. We still won't step you up. And as it continues, as the risk gets higher, you want to apply more friction. That's the element of how do I increase security and keep my user experience as disruptionless or frictionless as possible. So, by show of hands, you guys talked about, hey, a lot of us do two-factor, not a lot of us apply adaptive controls today. The industry is even taking the next step in trying to figure out how can I continue to iterate on what adaptive means? How can I continue to take on more telemetry and more intelligence and make, again, more finer decisions, maybe not even around access, but around the management of entitlements and permissions, et cetera. So same chart, now with another whole set of layers below the red waterline, if you will, that are now about the vulnerability management solution providing risk information to the authentication solution, the user provisioning solution providing information to the authentication solution, the mobile device management solution providing information from a risk perspective to the authentication solution. And notice the number of automated actions has increased to, before I talked about just allowing, stepping up, or denying. Now, what if we could proactively send out a password reset request to a known user and then add a second factor to it because we've noticed there is some credential anomalies. Whoops, sorry. I don't know if there's a timer set in my animations maybe, but clearly I've struggled with this device so far in this 20 minutes. What if we could be more proactive and tell Johnny, hey, listen, we think there's an anomaly with your credential, please reset your password. Or what if we could tell there's lateral movement that hasn't occurred on a regular basis and we could go into the provisioning solution or the application and trim permissions? What if we could tell that there is a server that has vulnerabilities that have been identified by the vulnerability management system, yet the folks responsible for applying those patches are still in the process of testing those patches against code on that application, and they're afraid to take that application down, so there's a number of days before that application actually gets fixed. What if we could provide that as a risk to the access management system so that all the users that have access to that server now have step-up authentication for some period of time while we wait for IT to get that server patches applied and back up to its current revision? I mean, I almost think the conversation is limitless relative to how we can apply those different areas of logic and data we have from our known endpoint solutions and systems today and apply that to the point of authentication, all with the mindset that we're trying to make it as secure as physically possible or as virtually possible, but as mindless and seamless and as flexible to our consumers as possible. Having worked for an authentication vendor and then having been in the identity and authentication space for a dozen years, by show of hands, how many people still have RSA second factor tokens? Okay. Of the two of you that do, is that your only method for a second factor, or do you have multiples? Only? Multiples. So, I mean, that's where most are headed today, right? So you want a solution that not only has this depth and layers of analytics. If I had a second chart on the right, you'd be looking for a way to deliver as many authentication factors as possible so that not only are you giving your end user all the analytics benefit to say, hey, I just want one username and password from you because I trust you, or at least I have some inherent understanding that I think you're less risky than others. You should also want, when you have to apply friction, you should want to give them the freedom to say, hey, I want it to come to my mobile device via SMS. Hey, I want it to come to me as a symbol to accept. hey, I want it to come to me as a second factor because I'm offline. Hey, I want it to come to me, right? You want to give them as much freedom, again, as your organization will tolerate from a risk perspective so that you can, again, increase security at the same time as increasing end user experience. So I have about 4 minutes left. Whoops. Happy to entertain questions around how to better secure your world from an identity and security perspective when considering your digital transformation initiatives. Questions? Yes.